Welcome to The State of Us.
Beyond mainstream cable news and party lines, with a millennial and a boomer, The State of Us pushes past the noise and uncovers all the issues that matter.
Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
Who will win the 2020 election? Well, I wish I could tell you definitively who I thought was going to win. And you might actually get to hear that in the third segment of today's program. But today we're focused on the keys to the White House. And what do we mean by that? Well, we're looking at a gentleman who supposedly claims there are 13 keys to the White House. His name is Allan Lichtman, and you may have heard of him before. He's been accurately predicting who will win the presidential election all the way back to 1984. Not only has he been making predictions that long, but he made it all the way back to 1860 using the same model, and it's worked every year, every presidential election since then. So what are the keys to win the White House? And more importantly, the thing that you're probably interested in, what does it mean for this year? Well, we're also going to look at why Allan tells us and why polls may not be the best predictor of who will win, why he believes this data-driven and relatively unbiased model is a better way to predict elections, a better way to see who will win in 2020. But of course, we couldn't begin a conversation on the 2020 presidential race, history, and all things politics without
TrueChat senior historian and an educator of more than 30 years. Here is your friendly redneck liberal, Lance Jackson.
Yeah, this has been around. He developed this keys system, as he calls it, in 1981, and he had developed it with the founder of the International Institute of Earthquake Prediction Theory and Mathematical Geophysics. So there's a lot of science based in this. It takes the personalities. And as he says in the article, Lichtman is a Democrat, but he predicted Reagan 2 years before Reagan's running mate even was announced by the Democrats in 1984. And that was when he started this. And he correctly, since 2000, he has started to pick the electoral college winner. Before he was just picking the popular vote, in 2000 kind of threw him for a loop. And so now since 2000, he has been picking based on who will win in the electoral college. And he got 2016 correct. He picked Trump, and he says, that Trump was not my choice, as he said, but I'm a scientist. I'm a predictor. It's not about my personal feelings. This is the mathematical equation that we have figured out that has been correct every 4 years since 1984. So it makes it very interesting as he goes through and explains what these 13 keys are and how the system works.
Well, and actually, Lance, right, even though he only started it in 1981, the estimate, the purpose of it is also based on historical data, which is part of, I'm sure, what you appreciate, because they did apply it all the way back to 1860 and received the correct outcome based on the keys. So in other words, you've got these 13 keys, right? And it's relatively straightforward in that, well, how do you know who wins with the 13 keys? When 5 or fewer of the keys are false. So in other words, these are true or false statements, right? When 5 of the keys are false, 5 or fewer, then the incumbent party wins. When 6 or more are false, the challenging party wins. So 5 or fewer are false, the incumbent, so in this case, Donald Trump wins. Or if 6 or more are false, that's where you get to the challenging party, in this case, Joe Biden wins. So again, the nice thing about this, and this is part of what's interesting about it, is it doesn't deal strictly with Republicans or Democrats or any particular candidate, really. It deals in the incumbent versus the challenger. And that's kind of what makes it an interesting model, very different from other stuff we see. And that leads us to, Lance, right? Why are polls, or at least from Allan's perspective, why are polls less, I don't want to say reliable, because again, that makes it sound like there's something inherently wrong with them. But his claim is essentially that they're a snapshot, right, Lance? Because they're just that isolated picture.
When you poll someone, you're asking them what they're thinking at that moment. And you're also asking them, which means you're not taking into account that they could change their mind before they vote, or that they've changed their mind 2 or 3 times. And so all you're getting is the answer in the moment that you ask the question. And so that's not necessarily, in his opinion, a very reliable way to predict the outcome of a race. And, because you're not getting it in real time. And there are other things that have taken place over a longer period of time that then are more reliable, which is where the keys come in and the mathematical side of this. As you said, he ran these through all the elections since 1860 and applied these same 13 keys and ended up with the same winner that history has shown us had won. So he's approached it from the mathematical sense and not the emotional bias that would come into any pollster or any question based, because we all know that when you do polls, the way you ask your question can sometimes determine the answer, which is why some polls are better than others and why there's always a margin of error of plus or minus whatever based on how many people you ask and how you frame the question to get the answers. And so this tries to take all of that out and seems to be pretty reliable, but we'll get into that a little bit more. I mean, it's reliable so far, right?
Yeah. And if people want to look at this information that we're referencing for themselves, of course, it's linked at thestateofus.org. One of the things that they provide as an introduction to it is the basis that Allan Lichtman's idea here, right, is that American voters vote pragmatically. And what do we mean by that? Well, in other words, the choice of a president doesn't depend on debates, advertising, speeches, endorsements, rallies, platforms, promises, yada, yada, yada. None of those things directly, at least this is Allan Lichtman's contention, those are not the things that sway the election. Rather, presidential elections are essentially referendums or referenda, I guess if we're being grammatically correct, right, Lance, on the performance of the party that's holding the White House. So that's the thinking behind it, is how have they done over the past 4 years? Does the country want a new direction, or does the country want to stick with the existing direction? And with that, we're going to look at the keys. We're not going to get through, there are 13, so we're not going to get through all of them here in the first segment. We are going to look at all of them through the second segment. And then at the end of the second segment, Lance, we'll actually get to hear Allan's, in his words, his prediction about what's going to happen in 2020. And then in the third segment, you'll get to hear whether or not Lance and I agree, because as we read through these, you will see where there is a little bit of discernment required in order to make a determination about whether or not a key is true or false. So Lance, do you want to walk us through the first 3 here?
Well, the first 3 are pretty simple. They're just numbers based or fact based. There's not any interpretation at all into this. First of all, the first one is party mandate. And basically it takes a look at the midterm elections and did the incumbent party hold more seats in the House than it did after the previous midterm elections. And I think most of us know that in 2018, the Republicans gained control of the House. And so, this would be false that, there's not a party mandate from the midterm elections for the Republicans. The second one is, was there any serious contention for the incumbent's position for his nomination? And that's obviously true. There was no serious contest. So since there was no serious contest, that would be, that would be a true. And the incumbency is the incumbent party candidate, the sitting president. Are they running? So I mean, those are just, how'd you do in the midterm elections previous to the election? 2 years earlier, did anybody challenge you for the nomination? And are you the incumbent? Those are the first 3. So it's pretty straightforward. There's really no room to argue. And even before you listen to Mr. Lichtman, you can probably think of what the answers are there, but they're just straightforward. Right.
Well, and that's kind of the mix of these keys and understanding them is as we get into some of the other ones, again, like Lance said, the first 4, right, are strictly fact-based. There really is no interpretation to them. Like the fourth one is third party. there's no significant third party or independent campaign, and there is not. And well, you might say, well, what's significant? If you read into his, Allan's stuff, it deals with, you need to see that there's a decent chance that they're going to win, at least one significant state, somewhere in the election. And, at least in 2020, that does not appear to be the case.
Well, they don't have to win a state. What history has shown us, and this is where history can play a role, third party candidates don't have to win states in the Electoral College, but they can determine who the winner is because they can pull enough votes off from one candidate or the other to allow a new candidate or a different candidate to win that state in the Electoral College than would have had there not been a third party. Third parties very rarely win an entire state, but they can play a dramatic role as to who the winner will in siphoning votes from one candidate or the other. And we don't see any of that. There will be third party candidates, on the ballot in your state. Most likely there usually are, but they're going to get so few votes that they're not going to determine the winner of the state. They're not they're not strong enough candidates to be siphoning votes from one candidate or the other.
So what we've got to look at coming up are the remaining keys. We've gone over 4 so far, 9 to go. And the 9 that we get into here is, of course, you'll see they get a bit more interesting. They're not quite as strictly data driven. And some of them have changed, I think, Lance, right, substantially because of this global pandemic, because of the coronavirus. And that's what makes it, I think that's where you're going to hear in the third segment, Lance and I get into a little bit of discussion about could these keys shift prior to Election Day? He has made, some predictions at this stage, but are there things that could still change that would affect this? So to find out what the remaining keys are and to hear who Allan Lichtman thinks will win the 2020 election and who Lance and I think will win, keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back.
We are The State of Us. Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
Who will win in 2020? Well, Allan Lichtman thinks that he knows the keys to the White House, and from a data standpoint, he's got a pretty good case, right, Lance? I mean, he's been doing this since the 1980s, and he's been right every time. And he's started also the Electoral College, and he's been right ever since he started that as well. And this is all data-based. It all fits and accurately predicts all elections back to 1860. And that's pretty interesting. Again, these keys are, many of them are data driven, but we're going to continue on here and look at some of these ones that are either are not necessarily exactly data driven, or if they're data driven, they may have only recently changed. So Lance, what's our next 2? Cause these deal with the economy, right?
Well, the first one, number 5, is the short-term economic outlook. And it is the economy is not in recession during the election campaign. So to your thing earlier, things could change. He's pretty much predicted these things long before the election takes place. So I'm not sure there's a whole lot that can change. There may be some interpretation, but when he does this, he does it months out because he's saying these things, these factors aren't going to change in the short term. These are all things that have either happened or haven't happened over the previous 3.5 years. So he predicts pretty far out. He doesn't take into account all of the things that could change right up to the election, and he's still been right. But I mean, at least that's the way I read it. Number 6 was the long-term economy has real per capita economic growth during the term equal or exceed the mean growth during the previous 2 terms.
So the English version of that, Lance, right, is the growth in this president's term better or at least as good as the previous 2 terms? Which
goes to, right, what I always taught you and all the other students I had in class, that you can throw all the polls out. When it comes time to go to vote, everybody pulls out their wallet or their purse and they look and see, do I have more money? They vote with their pocketbook. And that's kind of what I always gave that a big credence because I didn't have the mathematical data and all that he has done. but that's basically what number 6 is people look around and they say, am I better off now? And you hear the candidates on both sides always say that, are you better off now economically than you were 4 years ago? And he's just applied a mathematical equation to that phraseology that we hear in most presidential elections.
So the next key, Lance, it deals with policy change. And the thing I want to highlight about this one that I think is real important that people understand is it doesn't matter what the policy is, right? It has nothing to do with, was it a specific type of policy? Did most people like the policy? No, it's got nothing to do with that. It's very straightforward. The incumbent administration affects major changes in national policy. So the question for you at home to be thinking about is, has Donald Trump's administration affected major changes in national policy? Is that true or false? If it's true, it benefits the incumbent. If it's false, then it benefits, in this case, the challenger, Joe Biden. Number 8, social unrest. There's no sustained social unrest during the term. Now, keeping in mind, if you're kind of questioning what is social unrest, well, sustained social unrest, right, Lance, would be ongoing protests or ongoing civil uprising, that sort of thing. So again, be thinking about these as we go through them. You're going to hear from Allan, though, in just a minute. Number 9 is scandal. The incumbent administration is untainted by major scandal. So again, if true, it benefits the incumbent. If false, it benefits the challenger. Number 10 and number 11, Lance, these deal with military, right?
That's right. Number 10, foreign military failure. The incumbent administration suffers no major failure in foreign or military affairs. Okay. So it's just straightforward and again, you have that little glitch of major, and I guess you could argue that back and forth, but we'll see what Mr. Lichtman has to say when we get there. And then foreign or military success. The incumbent administration achieves a major success in foreign or military affairs. Again, as Justin stated time and again, if these are true, they favor the incumbent. If the answer to those are false, then it favors the challenger.
Right. And there's a lot of these, right? Like the economy too, Lance. If one is true as one is false, they kind of cancel each other out. The question is, do you see both false or both true? And that's kind of, again, as you're listening to Allan here, that's what you're going to want to be looking at. And then number 12 is incumbent charisma. So this is kind of, these last two deal with charisma. And this is kind of interesting, right? The incumbent party candidate is charismatic or a national hero. But Lance, what do we mean by charismatic? Okay. Cause this I think is important, right? As you're listening, to whether or not these last two are true or false, because the number 13 is the challenger's charisma, right? The challenging party is not charismatic or a national hero. So what do we mean when we're talking about charisma? How do we know whether or not we count them as charismatic?
I want to be really careful because I want Mr. Lichtman to tell us what he means because it's his definition that's important. But when I read those, it's very much, I take more of the national hero point. And that is, do you have, and you think of American history, you think of a war hero. You think of, how many, George Washington, Ulysses S. Grant, Dwight Eisenhower, very famous people who have ended up running for president, and they don't necessarily have a lot of political background, but they win because the people just like them. And that's when I think that kind of defines charismatic as well. But I'm very interested to see what Mr. Lichtman says. And remember, the key here, folks, if you're following along, if you kind of got your pen or pencil out, or in your head you've been checking off true or false, or if you're looking at the article and marking off each category, 5 or fewer falses keep the incumbent in office. 6 or more falses, the challenging party wins. So as we listen to what Mr. Lichtman is going to say here, compare with him with what you came up with and see if his prediction agrees with what you thought as you were going through. And if not, just sit back and listen and see what he has to say about each one of these 13 keys to victory.
So with that, we're going to now hear from Allan Lichtman. This is an interview that he did, an excerpt from an interview that he did with the New York Times, kind of providing some background on him. But the part that we're going to listen to is where he actually explains his prediction for the 2020 election. Let's listen in.
Remember, an answer of true always favors the re-election of the White House party. If 6 or more of the keys are false, you get a political earthquake.
Okay, number 1. The White House party gained House seats between midterm elections.
Republicans lost the U.S. House midterms in 2018, so false.
Number 2. There is no primary contest for the White House party.
No Republicans challenged Trump for his renomination, so true.
Number 3. The incumbency key. The sitting president is running for re-election.
Doesn't look like he's stepping down, so true.
4. There's no third-party challenger.
Despite claims by Kanye West to be running, this is a two-party race.
This is looking pretty good for Trump so far. Number 5. The short-term economy is strong.
The pandemic has pushed the economy into recession. False.
6. Long-term economic growth during this presidential term has been as good as the past 2 terms.
The pandemic has caused such negative GDP growth in 2020 that the key has turned false.
Number 7. The White House has made major changes to national policy.
Through his big tax cut, but mostly through his executive orders, Trump has fundamentally changed the policies of the Obama era, so true.
Number 8. There is no social unrest during the term.
There has been considerable social unrest on the streets with enough violence to threaten the social order, so false.
Number 9. The White House is untainted by scandal.
My favorite key. As I predicted, Trump was impeached. Plus, he has plenty of other scandals, so false.
Number 10. The White House has no major foreign or military failures abroad.
We've had some very difficult moments with Donald Trump, but so far, true.
11. The White House has a major success abroad.
While Trump hasn't had any big, splashy failures, he hasn't had any major successes either. So, false.
12. The incumbent party candidate is charismatic.
Donald Trump is a great showman, but he only appeals to a narrow slice of the American people. And as a result, false.
13. The challenger is uncharismatic.
Biden is a decent, empathetic person, but he's not inspirational or charismatic. So true.
That means
The keys predict that Trump will lose the White House.
that's Allan Lichtman's prediction. And Allan Lichtman is always right.
Don't just take my word for it. There are forces at play outside the keys. Voter suppression, Russian meddling. It's up to you, the voter, to decide the future of our democracy. So get out and vote. Vote in person. Vote by mail. As Abraham Lincoln said, the best way to predict the future is to choose it.
So that was Allan Lichtman, right? And his prediction there of what's going to happen in 2020. As you can see, he is predicting, right, that Joe Biden will win. And keeping in mind, if you're at home and you're like, oh, how could he do that? Or you're really excited about that. This is also the guy that said that Trump was going to win in 2016, right? So just be thinking about that here. Lance and I are going to break that down in just a second, but just be thinking about, as this guy said, his interest is in the data, right? So it's not, ooh, I hate Trump and I want to predict it this way. It's no, I predicted Trump was going to win in 2016, and now I'm saying something different. So Lance and I are going to break down what were some of the key things that went against the president or for Joe Biden that have caused this particular outcome, and also what do Lance and I think is going to happen. Do we agree that this is a good way to predict it? Do we believe that he's correct? To find out, keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back.
We are The State of Us. Here's your host, Justin T. Willer.
Allan Lichtman, he's a scientist, and he studied seismic models, right? He's worked with people who do geological work, and here he is saying, I know how to predict presidential elections. He's been doing it since 1981, and he's done it right every single time. 2000 was... He used to only predict the popular vote. So he was right in 2000, right, Lance? He wasn't wrong because he was predicting the popular vote. But then he decided, obviously, after the 2000 election, that it might be a good idea to, instead of predicting the popular vote, let's predict the outcome of the Electoral College, since that's what actually determines who becomes president of the United States. And as we know, that was obviously a wise change on his part because he was correct in 2016. He did predict that President Donald Trump would win. And in fact, you didn't get to hear it in the little excerpt we did, but when you watch the full interview with him, you would see that he actually holds up a signed letter that he got from the president saying, nice job on your prediction. The president obviously was very appreciative of the prediction in 2016. Of course, maybe not so much this time, as again, you heard he is predicting Joe Biden will win. And what were some of the key takeaways, Lance, that you took, that you saw right in his prediction, the things that clearly are going Joe Biden's way and really have maybe changed just in 2020? In other words, they're not something that if we had done these same keys back in 2019, we might have gotten a different result.
Well, I think the biggest one is short-term economy. Now, you can argue whether or not we're in a recession. Nobody's come out and said we're in a recession. I think everybody thinks we are because, you have to wait 3 months after, I think is the way the economists look at it. You can't call it while you're in it. You have to wait for 3 months worth of data to call it. But I think most people would agree that we've seen a significant short-term failure in the economy. And that would be the one quick change along with the social unrest. Now, you could argue that one though as well, because Charlottesville happened a long time ago. So there has been social unrest in the country for a long time during the president's administration. So I'm not so sure that, I think that's the one that you're leaning towards. The other big one is the social unrest. But I think the social unrest was there beforehand because you could also have the LGBTQ community, women, the picking of the Supreme Court justices that Trump, the things that they have gone through. There's been a lot of social unrest due to the unhappiness with some of the racial overtones that the president has brought up with his law and order mandate during these civil protests towards some violence that has gone on in our country. So yes, it's obviously much bigger right now than it has been, but I think that's been there the whole time. So I don't have that big of a problem with saying, with sustained. I think that one is sustained. The short-term economy one, that's the huge one that's really made a difference.
The long-term economy one isn't good for Trump either because of the drop in GDP that was recorded in the second quarter of this year. At least at the moment, most of the good in President Trump's term has been erased, at least by the coronavirus currently. Now, will we recover from it? I think, most economists, we even talked, right, to one just the other week, Joe Minerick from the Committee for Economic Development. The outlook is positive, right? The hope is that we'll get back there. But again, these don't deal with hope or possibility. They deal with right now. And when you factor in what COVID has done to the economy, he no longer meets that criteria of it being at least as good as or better than Obama's 8 years. Unfortunately, right, that is how the criteria is measured. So it's not really Obama specifically. It's just the 2 terms previous to Trump were Obama. And in those 2 terms, when you add up total economic growth versus the current economic growth, it's not doing well. So those are having that big effect. just as of late. And to your point on social unrest, Lance, I think even if, and that's kind of why I think this one's interesting, even if you want to contest that it's been sustained over 4 years, I think it'd be very hard to question that it's been sustained over the past number of months, right? We've had almost constant,
right,
either protests, or in some cases some riots, right? So we've had those going on now, pretty consistently over the past 3 or 4 months. And so even if we throw out the other stuff, which I'm not saying that we should, I tend to agree with you that I think there's been those undertones at the very least kind of the whole time. Now it's kind of undisputable now, right? That is occurring. And this doesn't assign blame though, folks, either. Remember.
Exactly. That's what I was going to point out. I'm glad you were going there because, it says in the article, there is no sustained social unrest during the term. It doesn't validate or invalidate the right or wrong. Who's making the point? Who's right? Who's wrong? It doesn't say that. It just says, is there? And I think, I don't know who could argue that there isn't. As you mentioned, the long-term economy, that's where I threw up a question mark. I'm like, Mr. Lichtman very quickly said, oh, false, because, right. And he showed the math. Okay. But I'm one who watches the stock market. And as I look at the stock market, it's a lot higher now than it was in the last 8 years. So I'm not disputing him because he's been right and I haven't done this and he's got the mathematical equations. If you want to look at the article, they explain how the math is done. And if you understand that, wonderful. I don't. So I'm not disputing his result. I just threw a question mark at that one because it's like, I might be able to give that one a true the way I look at long-term growth.
And that's the key, right? When looking at these keys is to understand how the person using them has looked at them. Because again, as Lance pointed out, he has a long track record of being right. So it's not to say that we're saying that he's wrong, but it is to say that if Lance and I were going to go through these keys, there might be one or two in here where we would have said something different than he would have, just purely based on what the key is called and what its definition is. And does that mean he's wrong? It does not mean that. It does mean that that's part of why you have to understand, the consistency or the constant in his case is he's always been the one determining what the keys are, or which way they go. And so he's not saying, here, Lance, you take this and now you do it and you'll get the same thing. Ideally, that's how it would work. But as you can see from what we're talking about, there is that possibility that won't. So what do you think, Lance? I mean, he says, right, Joe Biden's winning. He says, this is what the keys tell me. Do you believe him? Or you believe that Joe Biden's going to win?
No, not at this point. And that's because in this case, I'm not going to feel strongly about it either way because of the major, shock to my system of 2016, because I had always been a big believer in the polls, which is why this article was so interesting. I'd always followed the polls since I was a young man back in high school, always interested in presidential elections, ended up being a history teacher, had read about all the different presidential elections and the ins and outs. And I felt like I had a pretty good grasp on the way things would go and have normally been right in my predictions since back in 1972 when I was 12 years old and I started doing this on my own. I haven't been wrong. And this one, I just don't feel comfortable, as we've talked about many times, the way the Democrats will run the campaign, even though this article says the campaign doesn't matter. That's a hard thing for this old time boomer to just shake off. So I don't necessarily think though that Trump's going to win either. Okay. Cause when I went through and I did what I hope the audience did, before I listened to Mr. Lichtman's responses, I had 5 strong falses and 2 question marks. So where are the 2 question marks? So I'm not saying I don't believe Donald Trump's going to win either. I'm doing this fence sitting, that not making a decision that you don't like, that you've been on me about for years. I'm just not convinced that of either party right now. I just don't, it's very interesting. And like I said, my other question mark, and as I listen to Mr. Lichtman again, the incumbent charisma, because we'd have to say that Donald Trump is charismatic, but it doesn't move the majority. And that's kind of the definition of it. Okay. He's very charismatic to a certain base of people, which is typically between 35 and 39% of the population. And then you have the same percentage that is turned off, air quotes here, by his charisma. So I think that's the question mark that I have that I could change, which would then make it 6 falses. And with Mr. Lichtman's math, then makes it a Biden victory. So that's where I am. That's where, as I did this on my own, that's what I came up with.
Lance is kind of right. Some of these keys you feel are too close to call, you might say.
Right.
You understand the reasoning, but at the same time, they're like, you don't feel, and I felt the same way when I heard him explain a couple of them, basically the same ones you're mentioning, right? It's like, yeah, you're real confident in that, but I don't have that same confidence. Cause there are ones, right, where it's easy to have the confidence, like those party mandate, the contest, the incumbency, the third party, like those are no brainers, right? It's like, yeah, those make sense. We got it. Okay.
Policy change, social unrest, scandal.
Yeah.
Those are just check, one side or the other. To me, they're like, we can get a common answer.
Exactly.
But there are 2 of them, which makes the difference between whether there's 5 or fewer falses, which is then the mathematical equation.
Right.
Where you have to give credit where credit is due. The man's developed this. It's been successful. This is what he's saying. It would be hard for me to bet against him with his track record.
I'm at a similar place, but for a little bit different reason. It's not that I doubt the track record of this. It's that I want to believe his theory, Lance. I really do. And what I want to leave our listeners with to think about, his theory, right, that American voters are pragmatic. I want to believe that. At the same time, I cannot honestly tell our listeners right now that I 100% believe that, because I don't. I wish I did, but I don't. And since that's the theory this is based on, if I can't tell you that I believe the basis of the premise of this, then I also can't tell you that I'm confident in its outcome. Again, I'd like to be able to tell you that I'm confident in its outcome, but I don't think I can do that based on where we're at. What do you all think? We'd like to know. thestateofus.org. You can let us know there. And Lance, why are we doing this, right? We're talking about the keys to the White House today. We kind of went through it. We shared a different approach. Well, what's the purpose of going through stuff like this?
It's because here at True Chat, we have a mission statement for all the shows on the network. And the mission statement is to educate people by providing honest, open, and respectful conversations. And that's what we've tried to do. We've tried to educate you with somebody who does it differently than polling. And we found that very interesting. And we hope that you did too. And again, we've had the conversation. Now we can all sit back and watch and vote and see what happens.
The State of Us is released as a podcast by 4 a.m. on Tuesdays and Thursdays. It's also a syndicated radio show. But Lance, we need people to invite others to tune in. And one of the easiest ways to do that is to the podcast version, right? So if people want to encourage others to listen, what are some of the ways they could invite them to do that?
Right. If you've got your buddies and your family and they're saying, well, you keep talking about the State of Us. How can we listen? We tell them. We're on Spotify, Overcast, Stitcher, Apple Podcast, and everywhere podcasts are found.
For the State of Us on True Chat in Urbana, Ohio, I'm Justin T. Weller.
I'm Lance Jackson.
Special thanks to our recording producer, Devin McCain, and our editing producer, Bradley Butch. Thank you all for tuning in. We'll see you next time. Be the change. Be sure to check out our website, thestateofus.org, for books, articles, and all the ways to tune in. thestateofus.org.